I want to talk for a few minutes today about interruptions. Interruptions. Because the fact is, every one of us in this room, think about this, every one of us, our day is really spent navigating interruptions. Whether you're a student in school, whether you're a lady that's a teacher, a man that's a teacher, if you work in a factory, construction, if you're a retired senior adult, that every one of us in this room, our life is all about, our day is all about navigating through the disruptions, the interruptions of the day. Sometimes it's a conversation that you didn't see coming and that takes longer than you thought, but you can't walk away from it because the content of that conversation is so important. Sometimes the interruption comes and it's that text that you get that you weren't expecting, and that text comes, and all of a sudden, because of what that text says, everything else has to change. Sometimes it's the interruption of a phone call from the doctor's office about that blood work, about that test that you had done. And you were expecting to hear that everything was fine, but the result is not that everything is fine, and there's this disruption, there's this interruption. There are other times when the interruption of our life is that we know there's something that we ought to do that we're not doing, but we just don't want to do it right now. You know what I'm saying? We're like, you know what? I know I need to take care of this. I know I need to have this conversation. I know I need to make this phone call. I know I need to spend this time in prayer. I know I need to act in this way, but I just don't want to do it right now. And so I want us to see that these disruptions, these interruptions in our life often result in us saying those two words. Sometimes we say them out loud, like when our kids just won't leave us alone. They keep wanting us to come out and play, or they keep wanting us to do a project. They keep wanting to change the channel. They keep wanting to tell us something. We finally say, not now. And sometimes it's that not now in our own heart, in our own mind, when we just don't want to deal with it. We're like, you know what, really? Not now. I don't want to think about this right now. I don't want to deal with this right now. And oftentimes these disruptions, these interruptions that come, it's interesting because oftentimes it may not be necessarily always over big stuff. Sometimes it's just little things, but it's still an interruption. And then there are times when it's big stuff. It's like life-changing stuff. It's like rock to the core kind of stuff. And those disruptions, those interruptions also come. And I want us to look at a place in Scripture today where Jesus tells a parable, a story, about an interruption, and he uses this story of an interruption to really help us understand the power of not now. That sometimes the not now is on our side of the equation, right? That person comes and they keep talking and they're kind of lingering and you're kind of ignoring them, hoping they'll get the hint. Don't look at me like that. You've done that. And you're thinking eventually they'll just walk on by, right? Eventually they'll just go on back to what they're doing, and they don't leave, and so finally you have to say, you know what, not now. Or maybe it's at times that, again, that moment of information, that moment of responsibility that comes that you know you've got to deal with. And again, you finally say in your own heart, in your own mind, not now, I don't want to deal with this now. But either way, these interruptions have a way not only of wrecking our schedule and changing our day, but the reality is oftentimes interruptions, these disruptions, have a way even of changing our life. So I want us to look at a place in Luke chapter 11, beginning in verse number 5. Luke chapter 11, beginning in verse 5, where Jesus, it's red letter words, so that means it's the words of Jesus. Jesus, speaking to his disciples, gives a story about two men and about how one of them interrupted the night, the sleep of the other one, with a need that he had. Luke chapter 11, that's page 725. By the way, if you want to use the Bible in front of you, you can slide that out, turn to page 725. And not only is that Bible a great tool to use in this service, but listen, if you don't have a Bible that you can read and understand, we'd love for you to take that home. Let that be our gift to you. Just take it home with you. We'll replace it before next week, not a problem. If you know someone that doesn't have a Bible that you'd like to give one to, take that. Give that copy of Scripture to them. Luke chapter 11, we'll pick up here in verse number 5. Jesus says to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and he goes to him at midnight and says, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, because a friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have nothing to set before him.' Then the one inside," that's the man who is inside asleep, right? "The one who's inside answers, 'Don't bother me. The door is already locked, and my children are in bed with me. I can't get up and give you anything.' I tell you," Jesus says, "though he would not get up and give him the bread because of his friendship, yet because of the man's boldness, he will get up and give him as much as he needs." Really interesting story, isn't it? These two friends, one of them comes to the other at midnight asking for bread for another friend who's come on a journey. Now, it's interesting enough, but before we can really unpack exactly what Jesus is teaching about interruptions, right? Because this is an ultimate interruption in the middle of the night. This guy comes asking for bread. But check this out. We've got to understand the context. What's going on? Why did Jesus tell this story? Well, in the beginning of Luke chapter 11, the scripture simply says that Jesus was praying. And so as Jesus is praying, he takes a break. His disciples come to him, and because they know the power of prayer in Jesus' life, and because Jesus has modeled for them prayer, they say, Lord, teach us to pray. So the disciples see Jesus praying. They want to learn how to pray. So Jesus begins to instruct them. He begins to teach them. He begins to inspire them and to encourage them toward the reality of the power of prayer. He starts off with that familiar prayer, we sometimes call the Lord's Prayer, but really it's a model prayer, because he says when you pray, verse 2, you should pray like this: Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us, and lead us not into temptation. And so Jesus gives this model prayer. He's teaching them how to pray. And in the middle, look at this, in the middle of teaching on prayer, he shifts and starts telling the story about the two friends. So in other words, the story about the interruption, the story about the disruption in the middle of the night, is a story that's set in the backdrop of Jesus teaching on prayer. So we've got to know that to understand. By the way, Luke is amazing because Luke records 9 different prayers of Jesus in his gospel. 9 different times, Luke is careful to tell us what Jesus prayed, how Jesus prayed. As a matter of fact, out of those 9 prayers, 7 of those prayers that Luke shows us are only in Luke's gospel. So that tells us that Luke really zeroed in. Luke really paid attention when Jesus was talking about prayer. So it makes sense that he would have paid attention not only to the big teaching on prayer, but even the story that helps us understand the power of interruption, the power of disruption when it comes to our prayer life. And so I want us to walk through and kind of unpack this here as we look at this parable about interruption that really helps us to understand the power of persistence. So there's disruption, but then there's staying at it. Stick to it in this, right? There's this teaching that we have here that shows us about interruption, but also the power of persistence. So a couple of things I want you to notice. Notice, first of all, in verse number 5, Jesus says, suppose you have a friend, and look at this, and you go to him at midnight. Now, we read that, and we kind of go, yeah, that would be kind of aggravating, midnight. But here's what we've got to know. Our midnight is not the same as midnight in Jesus' day. Here's why. Think about this. We have street lights. We have night lights. We have cell phones. We have TVs that we watch late into the night, right? We have jobs and fast food places and gas stations and so forth that are open 24 hours a day. So midnight's not really that big of a deal anymore to us. But in Jesus' day, when Jesus said midnight, it was like the middle of the night, literally. It was like the dark night, you know. There were no street lights. There were no cars riding around. There was no Walmart that was open in case you forgot something. At midnight, when Jesus says this friend comes to the other friend at midnight, everyone listening would have went, whoa. Man, that's like when you've been in bed for a long time and you're in a good sound sleep and somebody comes and disrupts you. The interruption comes right as you're in the REM sleep, you know, and man, you're sleeping so good, and man, you're having these great dreams, and all of a sudden you're awakened by something. Some of you know what that's like. I remember when my kids were little, we would hear Micah usually coming down, but Emily was so quiet, and all of a sudden you got to get that sense of somebody standing over you. You with me? Somebody standing over you, and all of a sudden you kind of open your eyes slowly, and there's Emily. And she says, I can't sleep. Well, baby, I can't help you. Go back. You know, but no. So here, this is what's happening. Jesus says this one friend is in bed. He even says he's in bed with his family, and so they're all this one-room house, right? They didn't have separate bedrooms and all that. They didn't have a master suite and an ensuite. They were all so they're in the room, and Jesus says, suppose that you go to your friend at midnight, the middle of the night, the dark night. So that means you had to leave your house. There's no street lights. You don't have a flashlight. You might have lit some little lantern to take with you, and you go to your friend's house to ask him. And notice Jesus says, the reason you get up at midnight, the reason you go over and try to awaken your friend at midnight is because you have a friend who showed up at your house close to midnight. You with me? So you've had an interruption, and now you go to interrupt the sleep, to interrupt the night of your friend. And look what the text says. The reason you go is to ask for what? 3 loaves of bread. Now, we might read that and go, now, if Jesus says, suppose one of you is in the middle of the night and you have a friend that comes to you and he's like bleeding and he's dying, and so you go to get your friend who can help you try to stop the bleeding, that's an emergency. Or you wake up in the middle of the night and you have a friend who's come to you and he's on a journey and his camel needs a jump start and you don't have a jump start for the camel. So you go to get your neighbor's jump start so your friend can head on his way. That might even be an emergency. But when we read this, we go, wait a minute. The guy comes at midnight to ask for 3 loaves of bread. That doesn't seem to be an emergency. Well, the reality is, in the culture of Jesus' day, it kind of was. Because hospitality was a big deal. Taking care of someone who was a guest in your house, giving them something to eat, giving them a place to stay was a big deal. And not only was it an individual responsibility, this whole idea of being nice and being hospitable, but it was also a community responsibility. So in other words, in some ways, for the friend to go to his friend, it wasn't totally out of the question because after all, he had a friend shown up unexpected. He doesn't have any bread. He goes to the neighbor that goes to the friend to knock on the door to say, hey, let me have 3 loaves of bread. Now, even knowing all of that, even knowing, okay, he has someone who's come unexpected at his house, he doesn't have any bread, so he goes to his friend to borrow some bread to get 3 loaves in the middle of the night. Even with all that said, it's still, this friend coming to your door at midnight is still bad timing. That's the first thing I want you to jot down, bad timing. We all know what that's like. That sometimes the interruption that comes is not a big deal. It's not some earth-shattering thing. It's a small thing. It's something that you easily could meet the need of, but man, it's bad timing. Man, it's bad timing. When you're about to walk out the door and you get that phone call and you're stuck on the phone. Bad timing. Man, it's bad timing when you got to work early and you're trying to get everything done for the day so you can leave at 4 o'clock instead of 5 o'clock so you can make it to your kid's softball game or football game or make it to the dance recital and you've got everything wrapped up and just as you're about to walk out the door, the boss steps and says, hey, you got a second? Yeah, bad timing. We all know what bad timing feels like. And in this story that Jesus tells, remember, he's talking about prayer, but here he gives this picture of the one who's coming to ask for something, and it's bad timing. Isn't that always seen how it is? The interruptions and disruptions usually are at the worst time. They're usually at the time when everything is so focused. We're heading out the door. We finally settle quietly into our chair. We're on the way to somewhere else to meet someone else, and we have a disruption. We have an interruption. Bad timing. Now, we all know that some of us have been the one who's been guilty of the bad timing, right? When we wish we would have started by saying, is now a good time, but we just jumped into whatever we wanted to say, and then we go, oh man, I should have waited. This is not going to come out good. They're not going to hear what I'm saying. This is bad timing. But remember, Jesus is teaching on prayer. And Jesus uses this first part of the story when he gives the picture of bad timing, when he gives the example of bad timing to remind us, listen, church, there is no such thing as bad timing when it comes to praying. It doesn't matter if it's midnight. It doesn't matter if it's 2 in the morning. It doesn't matter if you've got a group of people with you or if you're all alone. There's never a bad time to pray. As a matter of fact, the only bad timing in our prayer life is when we don't pray. That's the only bad timing. There's no bad time to pray. There's some of us in this room, there's a need we have in our life, and we've been kind of waiting for the right moment, as if, I don't know if today's good. I mean, God was kind of busy with the storm, so maybe I'll wait till after that. Well, I got this going on, maybe not. And listen, there's no bad time. There's some of us, the problem is the reason we're not experiencing the closeness of the presence of God and the power of His purpose in our life is because we're not praying. Because we think that somehow it's just not a good time. It's not a good time for God, or it's not a good time for us. Bad timing. But in the bad timing, it's interesting because even though the man comes, the text says, Jesus says, at midnight, he asks for something pretty simple. It's not like he says, hey, you have an extra camel I can have, or hey, can you come help me build a house, or hey, can you come help me do... He asks for something kind of simple, doesn't he? He shows up at midnight, knocking on the door. The friend doesn't even get out of bed. He says, basically, what do you want? Will you lend me 3 loaves of bread? Bread? Yeah, 3 loaves of bread. That's all I need, 3 loaves of bread. Now, that seems to be a pretty small thing, doesn't it? I mean, you would think if your neighbor comes over and beats on your house, you hope they didn't say, hey, do you have some Pop-Tarts I could have? You with me? I mean, you're hoping they're going to ask for something that's kind of like a big deal. 3 loaves of bread. But here's what we've got to know. It was a simple request. That's the second thing I want you to write down. It was a simple request, but it was an important request. It was simple. And notice he doesn't just say, do you have something to eat? He doesn't even just say, do you have some bread? Notice Jesus is careful to say in the story that the friend asked the friend, the knocking neighbor asked the friend who's inside trying to sleep for 3 loaves of bread. Why? You ever thought about it? Well, why did he ask for 3 loaves of bread? Well, it's pretty simple to me. I think he asked for a loaf for the friend who had come, right? The stranger, or not stranger, but the friend who had shown up at night unannounced because he's wanting to provide for him. Well, he knows he can't just give him 1 loaf of bread and stand there and watch him eat. So he says, I need another loaf for me because I don't have any bread apparently. So there's a loaf for the guest who's come. There's a loaf for the neighbor. Now, what about the 3rd loaf? The 3rd loaf would have been so that he could be most hospitable and give the friend who'd come at night a loaf of bread for his trip the next day. Do you see it? So 2 loaves to share together, to eat together at the table that night. And then a loaf of bread for the friend who's journeying to take with him during his travels on his journey. So it kind of makes sense that he would have said, this is why I need 3 loaves of bread. I need 3 loaves, not 4, not 2, not 1, not whatever. I need 3 loaves of bread. But then think about this. Of all the things to ask for, bread. He doesn't ask for money. He doesn't, again, ask for a camel. He doesn't ask for a coat. He doesn't ask for sandals. He asks for bread. Why would he need bread? Because, again, it goes back to the hospitality of that day. That when you had a guest come into your home, no matter when it was, you would have been expected to prepare a meal for them. And in Jesus' day, the way that you would have eaten the meal was not with a knife and fork, it was with bread. In other words, each person would have had a loaf of bread, and each time they wanted to take some food out of the main dish, they would use a torn off, fresh piece of bread that they had torn off, a new piece of bread. They tear off the bread, they use it to dip or to eat from the main dish. That way, it keeps the main dish from getting defiled by everybody just reaching in with their hands, right? Because they didn't have indoor plumbing, they didn't wash their hands. So they used the bread, you tear off a piece, get you a little bit more. If you want extra, you kind of use it to scoop it up. So it makes sense that if he's going to put food before this man, he's got to give the man some way to eat the food, and the bread was what served as the utensil to eat the food. And it kept the main dish from getting defiled. It kept the main dish pure. It's kind of like this. When our kids were little and we go to Mexican, we had a little simple rule, real simple. And here's the rule. Double dip, lose your chips. Okay? That's what Jesus is talking about here. Double dip, lose your chips. In other words, the neighbor says, listen, I got to have this bread because I got to feed this guy, and he can't be reaching in, and we can't be reaching, so we got to have some bread so we can dip it, right? Now, I know some of you think it's cute when your kids dip the chip in and then they lick it off and put it up. That's not cute. That's gross, okay? Let me just help you. Man, I told my kids, you double dip, you ain't getting no more chips, all right? You're done. Double dip, lose a chip. And see, listen, the neighbor was wanting to do everything just right, so he comes to the neighbor who's asleep. The one who's awake comes to the one who's asleep and says, I need this bread. But have you thought about this? It's a simple request. Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. The bread that they would have eaten together at the meal, the bread that would have been used as the utensils. But then I had to think, well, wait a minute. How does this guy know that his sleeping neighbor, how does the knocking neighbor know that the sleeping neighbor has bread in the first place? You ever thought about that? Well, in Jesus' day, again, the women would have gotten together. They would have made these big batches of bread, and oftentimes they would have distributed among themselves. But sometimes they might have said, here, we'll work on our bread today. Tomorrow we'll make your bread. So maybe the next day is when he would have had his fresh bread, but he doesn't have any at the moment. The neighbor knew that, the knocking neighbor knew that the sleeping neighbor had the bread, or he wouldn't have asked him in the first place. And notice he knows the man has at least 3 loaves of bread because he says, will you lend me 3 loaves of bread? He's very specific in his simple request. Now think about this again. Jesus is talking about prayer. He's teaching on prayer. So he shows us there's no bad timing when it comes to our prayer life. But then secondly, look at this. The simple request is this. The knocking neighbor comes to the sleeping neighbor because he knows that the sleeping neighbor has the bread that he needs. Too many times, we almost pray to our boss, to our friend, to the government, to the benevolence ministry. We're just shy of actually lifting up prayer, asking for provision from anyone except God. The reason we come to God and say, God, here's what I need, here's my simple, specific request, is because we've got to recognize He has what we need. You with me? He has what we need. No matter what it is that you need in your life, whether it's healing that you need, whether it's hope that you need, whether it's the restoration of a broken heart, whatever it is that you need in your life, God has it. He has exactly what you need. The knocking neighbor says to the sleeping neighbor, give me 3 loaves, lend me 3 loaves of bread. He knows the sleeping neighbor has it. Can I tell you something? Do we really believe that God has everything we need? Do we really believe that He can meet every need? Do we really believe that it's no big deal for Him to meet the simple request? I think too often our prayers lack because we don't think that God's interested in our simple request. We think the timing is bad. Or we think that our request is not so simple. We think it's too big. We think we're asking God for something beyond what He can do. Hello? Blow your mind. He's God. There's nothing you can need. There's nothing you can ask for that's beyond what He can do. And so here the knocking neighbor comes to the sleeping neighbor with this simple request. Friend, he says in verse 5, lend me 3 loaves of bread. Now the story would make sense here if Jesus said, and the man got up and gave him 3 loaves of bread, and they high-fived each other and said, hey, have a good night. But that's not what happens. Like Jesus often does in his stories, he puts another twist. The first twist is he's saying to his disciples, suppose one of you goes to your neighbor in the middle of the night to ask for bread, and they're going, man, I wouldn't do that. Man, you talk about testing your friendship, right? I mean, you might have been friends, but you come knock on the door for some Pop-Tarts in the middle of the night, we might not be friends anymore. But notice Jesus goes on, he turns again, verse 7. And suppose the one inside, so there's a knocking neighbor outside, the sleeping neighbor inside answers, don't bother me. The door is already locked, and my children and I are in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. Now, look close at what he says here. The door is locked. My children and I are in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. In other words, I can't give you anything because if I get up, it's going to disrupt everybody who's asleep, and it's just not worth it. Have you seen my kids when I wake them up from deep sleep? Yeah. Have you seen my wife when I start? No, I can't help you right now. The neighbor who's sleeping has legitimate excuses, right? The door's locked. We're all in bed. I can't help you right now. He doesn't say, I'm not going to give you anything ever. He says, not right now. In other words, here's the third thing I want you to write down, not now. The neighbor says, not now. Not now. He doesn't say, I'm never giving you bread. He doesn't say, get lost, don't ask me for bread. He doesn't say, I only have 1 loaf of bread or I have no bread. He says, I can't because the door is locked. We're all in bed. We're all asleep. I can't give you anything right now. Now think about this. When it comes to the disruptions and the interruptions in our lives, some excuses are real. Now, if you're like me, I don't do good with excuses. My kids can tell you, I don't want to hear an excuse. Our staff can tell you, I don't want to hear, I'd rather you just say, look, I blew it, I missed it, I didn't make the call you asked me to do, I didn't follow up, I didn't do this, I didn't anticipate this. I do much better than that. Don't give me excuses. But you know what I've learned? There are times when excuses really are legitimate. Not very often, but there are times when excuses really are legit. And that's what we have here. There were legitimate excuses, just like we have in our life. Sometimes there's interruptions that require time that we really don't have to give. But somehow we feel like we got to find that time. We have disruptions that require resources that are scarce to us at the time. So we've got to decide, do I use my scarce resources to help and bless this person? There are times when not now really is a fair response. Not now, I can't do it right now. But notice the way Jesus couches the not now is that it's not only that it's true, there are legitimate excuses, but Jesus presses because he goes on to talk about how the man keeps on knocking, so the one who's sleeping still can't sleep, so he eventually gets up and helps the guy. That there are times when even though not now seems legitimate, not now still needs to become now. There are some of us, we have said, you know what, I know I need to take this to the Lord in prayer. I know I need to trust God with this particular thing in my life, but we're holding on to it and we're thinking, not now. Let me work on this some more myself. Let me get this sorted out. Let me wait until this. And somehow we're trying to kind of time things out with God. We're trying to market time with God. You know, we're trying to anticipate, well, you know, maybe I can catch God at a better time. Maybe I can get God in a moment where he says, okay, sure, yeah, I'll do that for you, no big deal. See, oftentimes, listen, there's some of us, remember Jesus teaching on prayer, there's some of us, the problem in our prayer life is that we have fallen into the not now, and the not now becomes not tomorrow, nor the next day, nor the next day. You with me? There's some of us, we need to say, right now, Lord, I'm coming to you in prayer. Right now, I'm bringing this need to you, and I'm not just going to say, I need some bread. I'm going to say, I need 3 loaves of bread, and here's why I need it, because someone has shown up, another friend has shown up at my house, and I didn't know he was coming, and I got to provide. Lord, I need this in my life, and this is why I need it, and Lord, you're the only one who can provide it. I'm trusting you. Do you see it? Not now. But notice Jesus, in this part of the story, he says that he's saying to the disciples, suppose one of you, we're the ones asking. So that would mean that in this story that Jesus gives, the sleeping neighbor is God. So does that mean God's asleep and is like, don't bother me? Because we're told other places in Scripture that God never sleeps. He never slumbers. So what is Jesus trying to say here? He's showing us, again, the words, not now. That sometimes when God does not answer our prayer immediately, when God does not open the door immediately, when God does not do immediately what we think he should do, sometimes we say, well, God said no. Well, he didn't say no. He said not now. Yeah, well, that might as well be no. No, we're good if we knock and, we're knocking and God opens and says, hey, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Here you go. Here's 3 loaves of bread. We're like, that's what I'm talking about. God's efficient. But if we knock and we keep knocking, and it seems like God's saying to us, not now, we take that as a no. But notice Jesus in the story doesn't take the not now and turn it into a no. He takes the not now to say, keep on doing what you're doing. Even though the timing is bad, and even though the request is simple, keep on praying. Keep on asking. Keep on trusting. See, too often what happens for us is we don't keep on. We first of all, we think not now. We don't want to pray about it now. And when we do pray about it now, we don't keep on praying. We wait for difficulty, we wait for tragedy, and then we pray. We need to be praying before, and yes, even during and even after the difficulty and the tragedy. Do you see it? Not now. He's teaching on prayer. So why is it then that Jesus would give this example and have God as the one who's in the home, who says he's asleep and says, I can't give you anything right now, I won't give you anything right now, not now. Why? Because we see the answer at the end. The end of the story helps us know why Jesus put this in the story in the first place. Look again closely at the text, verse number 8. He says, I tell you, even though he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship. In other words, you would think he'd say, oh, I know your voice, I know who you are. Hey, no problem, here's some bread. He says he's not getting up because of the friendship, but, verse 8 ends, but because of the man's boldness, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. The knocking neighbor had his need and the need of his friend met even more so because he kept on knocking. He kept on asking. He kept on seeking. That's what Jesus says in the next 2 verses, verses 9 and 10. He says, you got to keep on asking. You got to keep on seeking. You got to keep on knocking, and then you will see God do. So wait a minute. Why would God say not now to us in the first place? Why in the bad timing of the simple request would God say not now? Why in your life, why in my life does God ever say not now? Is it because the bread's still cooking? Is it because he doesn't have enough bread? Is it because he really doesn't want to be bothered? No, it's none of that. It's because, listen, he has even more that he wants to do. Look at the end of verse 8. Jesus says that because the man is persistent, because he keeps on knocking, he keeps on asking, and he keeps on seeking, eventually the sleeping neighbor opens the door to the knocking neighbor, and not only does he say, here's 3 loaves of bread to get lost, he says, here 3 loaves of bread are, no, what else do you need? So the knocking neighbor gets even more than what he had even potentially come to ask for. Do you see it? I love that. The key there is in verse number 8 when Jesus describes the knocking neighbor. And he says, because of the man's boldness, some translations say because of his persistence. And both of those are good words, and they kind of need to be mashed together to really understand the original word here, the feel of what Jesus was saying. And the word that Jesus used there literally means the shameless, ongoing, bold, consistent, persistent. In other words, he doesn't just knock once, get a response and go, well, he said no. Figured that. I knew he wouldn't help me. Well, he said no. I guess I'll never ask him again. He'll never give me bread again. No, he keeps on knocking. Do you see it? And we don't know how long in the story this was. It might have been a few minutes, might have been some time passed. And he kept on knocking. And eventually the sleeping neighbor gets up and says, you know what, because you're so bold, I want to give you what you need and whatever else you need, as much as you need. Of whatever you need, I want to give you. The knocking neighbor, the sleeping neighbor, they both had audacious actions. That's the last thing I want you to write down. Audacious actions. Now think about that word for a moment. I love that word audacious. We don't use that word in church a lot. We try to be safe, don't we? But literally what Jesus says here, he might as well use the word audacious. It means this neighbor who came knocking to wake up the sleeping neighbor over 3 loaves of bread, the simple request at a bad time, who gets told not now but keeps on knocking. He's so audacious because he's surprisingly bold and risky to keep on knocking over and over and over and over, even when the guy says, look, I'm in bed, not now. Listen, I'll give you the bread in the morning. You were my friend. You keep on knocking. You ain't my friend no more. He keeps on knocking. Do you see it? There's some of us in this room. We've come to God one time with a prayer. We've come to God with a need one time. We said, Lord, I need 3 loaves. Lord, I need you to do this in my life. And you know what happened? We somewhere bought into this false idea. Well, I gave it to the Lord and I just forgot about it. That's not what Jesus said. He said, yeah, you give it and you trust God. Doesn't mean you take it back from the altar in the sense of, okay, you're not doing it, God, I'll do it. No, you keep coming back to God over and over and over and over, because here's why. He's the only one that has the bread you need. He has the 3 loaves. He's the friend. He's the one that you trust. And even though you may think he's saying no, he's saying not now. And why is God making you wait? Why is he saying not now to you? Why is he saying not now to me? Why does he sometimes say not now to us? Because he has something even more that he wants to do. Audacious actions on the part of the one who keeps on knocking, audacious actions on the part of God who does the giving. Do you see it? Wow. How awesome is that? That we keep on. And Jesus made that so clear because, again, in those next verses 9 and 10 of Luke chapter 11, Jesus, just so we don't miss it, says, now guys, let me tell you, I gave you this, I taught you to pray, I gave you the model prayer, I gave you this story. Now let me tell you what that story is about. Keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Because sometimes you're asking for 3 loaves of bread and God wants to give you more than 3 loaves of bread. Sometimes you're asking for God to do this one thing. God, if you'll just do this, this will just be awesome. Lord, I need you. And God's saying, I can do that, but I want to do more than that. So sometimes the not now is preparing us for the more. The not now is preparing us to keep on trusting, to know, you know what, I'm not going to, I know you have what I need, Lord. I know that not only do you have what I need, but check this out, you are who I need, Lord. And notice the audacity of the one who's knocking that also is reflected in the audacity of the one who's sleeping, who gets up and does the giving. Both the one who's knocking and the one who's giving, don't miss this, check this out, is not just to benefit the one who did the knocking. Why did he come in the first place? Because he had a friend who's traveling who came to his house. Can I tell you something? There's some of us, the reason we're missing the audacious giving of God is because all we ever ask for is for something for us. I need, I want, me. And yet Jesus said, I came and gave my life as a ransom, as a payment, as a payoff for many. Jesus said, I came to seek and save that which is lost. But so often we make our faith, we make our relationship with God, we make our trust, we make our prayers all about ourselves. The neighbor didn't come to say, hey, I need this. He said, I need it so that I might give it to this friend who's traveling. Do you see it? Sometimes the not now is so that we will be willing to share the blessing with others when God meets whatever that need is we're asking him for. Do you see it? There's some of us in this room, we've bought the lie of bad timing. We're waiting for a better time to come to the altar and to ask God for something, to ask God for help, to even ask God for more of himself. We've stopped knocking. We've stopped asking. We've stopped seeking. We've bought the lie that it's just not a good time, apparently. There's some of us, we bought the lie that says, well, it's such a simple request. It's just 3 loaves. I'm not going to bother God with this. I can sort it. I can fix it. But you don't have any bread. I know I don't have any, but maybe he won't know the difference. No, he'll know if you don't have bread, because when you sit down, he's going to be like, what am I supposed to eat this with? There's some of us, we think our request is too simple for God. Then there's some of us, we're on the other side. We think that what we're needing from God, the move of God we need in our life, we think it's too big for God. Then there's some of us, the fact is we've walked away from the not now. That in our prayer life, that when God has said not now, we took that as a no and we just gave up. But yet again, Jesus says, keep on asking. Keep on seeking. Keep on knocking. So even in the not now, God's up to something. What about in your life? Is this a not now moment? And are you continuing to trust and believe God to do what only He can do? Maybe it's for a family member. Maybe it's for a friend. Because if all of your not now moment is all about you, then you need to get a new not now moment. It needs to be about how God can move through your life so that you might be a blessing, an example, an encouragement, that you might stand in the gap for someone else.